feel like a bit of an interloper for two reasons. First, I'm going to talk about memory, not decision-making. Memory, obviously, your memory for evidence will have some bearing on decision-making, so I don't think it's completely off topic. And the second, I'm sort of doing what Dan referred to as level one. I'm a cognitive psychologist. I don't know a great deal about jury decision-making or juries in general, but I'm mainly interested in social aspects of remembering, and in particular how conversations affect and shape your memory. And what juries do and under deliberation seems to me is often a long, extended conversation in a very narrow topic. I recognize it's not a normal conversation, and I'll get back to that at the very end, but give me patience to at least let me tell you something about conversation and memory. We're going to have to figure out how to work this. Yes, I'm going to skip over this first two slides. And when I started to look about how juries think about memory what I realized was that courts are very, very suspicious of what I would call mnemonic technology. So we mentioned note-taking, for instance. Even today, at least since 2007, note-taking is not permitted in all courts systems, and courts do not always supply pencil and paper if they allow note-taking. Readbacks. The courts are not required under every instance supply a readback that a jury may want. And they prefer that the readback be read to the jury in an oral manner, which only increases the burden of memory in the first place. And they want the readbacks to be short, they don't want them to be long, and they are very reticent to give a written transcript because that will allow for some undue emphasis on selected passages. And in particular, in U.S. versus Montgomery, you have this very interesting instruction that suggestion about instructions to the court and about memory and written transcripts. And it says, I want you to bear in mind that the testimony at trial is the evidence, not the transcripts. This transcript is not authoritative. If you remember something from what appears in this transcript, your collective recollection is controlling. In other words, the transcripts may not serve as a substitute for the collective memories of the jury or take the place of the assessment of the reliability of witness subject to usual rules. Also, as the court previously instructed you, you must weigh all the evidence in the case and not focus on one portion of the trial. Here, the notion is that you are supposed to trust your collective memory as opposed to what you see in the written transcript. Now, I assume that the court has come to this conclusion because they think if 12 people remember something in exactly the same way, it must be right, and the clerk must have made some sort of error. But the psychological evidence suggests otherwise, that collaborative remembering can actually distort memory in very specific ways, and that you will collectively come to selectively come to a distorted memory. Now, the literature on sort of collaborative remembering or conversational remembering falls into sort of two major issues. First is they look at exactly what people remember when they get together and they try to remember the past. That is what happens in the group recounting. And in the second part, they look at what the consequences are for that on subsequent individual memory. And if you think about a jury deliberation, you have things being remembered by the group which over this extended period of time may lead to an alternative representation that the individuals hold about what they heard during the evidence taking. Just very quickly, the group will remember more than an individual might, but the group does not remember the sum of all the individual memories. So the group is not the collective memory in the sense of the sum of all the individual memories. They remember less than each individual in sum can remember. There's an information sampling bias, so you tend to remember what everybody else already knows rather than what you know individually. There's audience tuning. If you know somebody doesn't want to hear something, you won't mention it. If you know that they want to hear it, you may mention it. And there's sort of a sharing of responsibility that transacts of memory in which some people will feel that they are more likely to sort of have to remember this than others. The key here is that when groups remember, they remember selectively. They do not remember everything that they are capable of remembering. And that's going to have a, I'm going to try to go relatively quickly because I'm behind. That's going to have implications for what you subsequently remember. If you think about the effect of this selective remembering on subsequent memory, because you're selectively remembering such things, obviously you're going to have a rehearsal effect. You're going to essentially increase your memory. Each member of the jury, if you like, will have a better memory for the things that are actually mentioned within the jury deliberation. There are sayings believing effects. This is by Tori Higgins and Gerald Eckerhoff, where basically the audience tuning that they don't look about this in the context of the jury. It's a very experimental sort of situation. But basically, what a speaker says to a listener reshapes their memory in a that's consistent with the way that they tune what they said to the listener's preferences. So audience tuning actually can change your memory. So not only do you have certain rehearsals, you will actually begin to remember it in a way that's consistent with the way you tuned it to the audience. There are social contagion effects. We've talked a lot about eyewitness testimony. It's very interesting to me that when Beth Loftus first did this work, she never talked about it in a social context. The word social never appears, but really it's about a speaker reshaping the memory of a listener. What I want to talk about is that not only does selective memory present the possibility of imposing misleading information on other members of the group, not only does it allow you to rehearse some things, not only does it allow you to sort of remember things in the way that you tuned it, but it can also induce forgetting. That is, it can make it very hard for you to remember certain things that you heard previously, and it turns out that it's actually better if you never had the conversation in the first place than if you have a conversation remember selectively. And this is going to turn out to be true not only for the speaker, but also for the listener. So that both speaker and listener can end up forgetting exactly the same thing. So they end up with a collective memory not only that reinforce for what was said, but they have trouble accessing the things which they did not hear. Now this builds on work by Mike Anderson. This is as ecologically invalid as you can possibly get. During the study phase, you study word pairs, fruit, apple, fruit, orange, bird, robin, bird, swallow. Then you have a practice trial. This is going to be transformed into actual conversation in a second. But you have a practice phase where you practice selectively fruit, apple, by saying fruit, AP, and then you have to retrieve apple. And then you're tested, so you say all the fruits, say all the birds. And this is important because I'm going to use this vocabulary, and if you don't get this vocabulary, you might as well just go to sleep. For the items that you practiced, they're called RP+, for retrieval practice. For the items that you did not practice, but are related to the items that you practiced, they are called RP-. And for the items in which you are not related to the items that you practice, they're called NRP, for no retrieval practice. Now, if what's causing the forgetting is a simple decay model, that if you just don't hear it, it decays after a while, you would expect that you would forget RP- items as much as you would forget NRP items. That is not the case. What Mike Anderson shows, and there's at this point hundreds of experiments on this phenomenon, is that you're much more likely to forget the items that are related to what was said, that you retrieved, than if they were unrelated. Now, Anderson's experiment is a fairly typical psychology experiment, and it's about what an individual does and its effect on that individual's memory. But I said that I was interested in conversations. Does this extend to listening to someone? Now, if one of the things when you listen to someone is you concurrently retrieve. I hear somebody tell a story and that I know already about, and I retrieve along with them. I don't always have to retrieve. That concurrent covert retrieval is optional. Yes. That covert retrieval is optional. But in a jury, for instance, jury deliberation, you may want to really check the accuracy of what your fellow jurors say about the evidence. To that sense, you're going to concurrently retrieve. If I'm at a dinner party and my partner is telling a story, I might not really care if it's accurate or not. I might care if people laugh at anything. So there's different conversational goals, but I think accuracy is a conversational goal in jury deliberation. And you would expect, under these circumstances, for that you would get, if you're monitoring for accuracy, you would get concurrent retrieval of the covert on the part of the listener, and hence you should get this sort of induced forgetting effect. And if you essentially redo Anderson's experiment, but now have a listener sit and monitor what the person is retrieving, and they have to say if they think they're right or not, versus they have to say whether you think they were fluid in their response or not. What you find is, and so the experiment is very similar now with two people. What you find is you find retrieval-induced forgetting both for speaker and listener when you monitor for accuracy, but you do not find retrieval-induced forgetting for this listener when you monitor for fluidity. So when accuracy is the goal of your monitoring, your listening, you get the same forgetting for the same type of items, that is, items related to what was retrieved, for both speaker and listener, and you get this convergent memory. You can have people study stories, and then instead of having them selectively practice it, using this experimental manipulation, you just ask them to talk to each other. Under those and then you ask them to recall the story. Under those circumstances, you get very nice, profound retrieval-induced forgetting. So if you never had that conversation with someone, you would be less likely to forget information than having that conversation and selectively remembering it. So having a conversation can induce you to actually forget certain pieces of, let's say in this case, evidence. And depending on the way in which that conversation emerges, you will selectively forget some things over other things. It occurs for memorable material, for information that is central to the story. It occurs for autobiographical information. It occurs for biology text. This was funded by NSF, and they wanted me to look at science stuff. So it occurs for biology text. It occurs for lectures on biology and astronomy. And it can be found after a week delay. And we're currently trying to get it after a month. Interestingly, I'll just very rapidly go over it. If you think somebody is an expert, if there's an expert and you're trying to impose misleading information, we know from a host of evidence that it's easy to impose experts. It's easy to impose misleading information. But when it comes to this what I call socially shared retrieval-induced forgetting, if it's an expert, there's no reason for me to concurrently retrieve. Why should I bother? It takes a lot of work. I'm not going to bother to do that. So what you would expect is that experts should be able to mislead people and implant memory, but they shouldn't be able to induce forgetting. And that's exactly what we find, that experts can mislead and implant memories, but they can't seem to induce this forgetting. The selective remembering, listening to selective remembering doesn't do it. On the other hand, if you don't trust the person that you're listening to, under those circumstances, social contagion, you should have a hard time implanting a memory, but you should monitor for accuracy like crazy because you don't trust this person, and therefore you should get retrieval-induced, socially shared retrieval-induced forgetting. And that's exactly what you find. I don't know. I don't have that slide. But that's exactly what you find. So the bottom line here is that how a speaker talks to another juror. Well, now I recognize this is not within a jury. It may not hold for juries. I don't know. But this is, as I said, an example. Level one, it's a phenomenon. It would be interesting to sort of see if it actually occurs within jury setting. But I'll just assume that it does. How a speaker talks to another juror will affect memories for both speaker and listener. One jury can implant misleading information in other jurors. Jury deliberation can reinforce some memories while inducing forgetting for others. The effect leads to a shared representation of the past among this group. So that what the group slowly evolves is a representation of the past that reflects the conversation that occurred prior to that. And that not includes just not reinforcing some evidence, but actually inducing forgetting for others. Thank you. This is all the people that helped, and these are all the people that paid for this.
Okay, it's time for the Second City Improv team. I'll leave it to you to figure out which one of us is John Belushi and which one of us is
you can view, select, or change your seat assignment online.
Gilda Radner. This conference is quite an experience for me for a number of reasons. About 20 years ago, I stopped going to almost all conferences. It wasn't for reasons you might imagine. I decided it was really important for me not to do extra traveling while my kids were at home. So last year, my last child left the house, and so I've wakened up and I'm coming to conferences again. And it is a bit of a Rip Van Winkle experience, 20 years of slumber. But it's a very positive experience, unlike Rip Van Winkle's. He was glad to wake up from the dream that he was actually having. I don't know where the control is. Let me start off. I'm going to try to move faster than my slides, and the slides were made up early this morning, and so they don't exactly match what people have talked about. Not their fault, partly mine. So a first summary remark is that I'm really inspired by Dan and Norbert and Rob McCoon, who's not here, and Ted Eisenberg's examples. I think there's a huge hole in research on jury decision making because we don't have these huge, dense databases to work from. I was struck by Jen's talk. We know an incredible amount about people who are incarcerated. If we just focus on sentencing by judges, there's an incredible amount of quantitative information. And if you think about these popular behavioral economics books by people like Stephen Levitt and others, and you think of this sort of buzzword that we're in the age of big data and data mining, and Google and Facebook and all of these companies are creeping into our lives because of the incredible amounts of data they have about us. We need that for juries, and I hope agencies and individual researchers will promote the development of that. Why don't court systems have a dashboard where they record just the rudimentary details of the juries and the cases and the dispositions? I can't imagine what young people, like PhD students here, and especially from other fields that are even more into quantitative detective work, what they could come up with as at a minimum prima facie arguments for what's important and hypotheses about what's going on. What if we discover there's an anomalous but reliable high-hung jury rate for a certain type of case, or for juries composed in certain ways? I think it's Edie who pointed out, with these archival data sets, there's always problems with selection, but then the data analysts are more and more sophisticated about how to model and control for selection, and there's always problems for hidden variables. But again, your generation is an order of magnitude more sophisticated about how to do those correlational analyses. Second point, I'll talk a little, actually let me jump to point 3. It warms the cockles of my heart, of course, to wake up after 20 years and discover people still know what the story model is. And people are saying it's the go-to model. I think I heard the word elegant. I should just get off the stage and go have a drink. So I'll make some remarks, I'll try to keep them brief, about what I think story model research should look at. But again, I'll probably reserve most of that for conversations offline. And then finally, I want to say a few words about alternatives to the story model. Let me go through what the speakers suggested to me. I was confused by Dan Simon's presentation. I didn't quite get the title. I'm not sure what his concept of ecological validity is. I'm not sure it's any less valid than my kind of murky comprehension of that term. But I guess I thought the right talk for his title was against the study of deliberation, not against ecological validity. But let me just credit Dan with being, his tables were what really primed my enthusiasm for these archival, real jury outcome databases. A beautiful way of using that argument, and of course supported by other people. Lori's talk, of course I would love to just discuss it for several hours because it focused on the story model. There's good news and bad news about the story model. Good news is, I think, I'll just stipulate, and you can laugh quietly to yourselves, that it really is a valid description of a lot of what most jurors are doing in jury decision tasks in most cases. The bad news is it's a great framework, it's a useful vocabulary, there's a lot of truth in it, but it's going to be what you were looking for in the first place. So it was all preceded by labor-intensive, since we were using fairly rich cases, analyses of other subjects, think-alouds and ratings and memories. But we know what the story was we were looking for, and we designed sets of 12 or 16 what we called turning point questions. And a particular template or pattern of answers to those questions. Was he angry or afraid? Was he carrying a knife at time 1? Was he, did his friend join him before or after he went into the bar? A series of answers to those, yes, no, would type a juror as having one story in their head or another. And again, it was inconclusive. We ran out of NSF money. But what we wanted to do was look at the extent to which the template of answers to those questions was different at the start and the finish of jury decision-making or jury deliberation. I still think that's a really good route to go. And I would go, that would probably be the first studies I'd do. I'd take cases, extract what I thought were the primary stories, tried to come up with a method to measure whether the story changed from the beginning to the end, and then try to do essentially correlational analyses, and then maybe go on to manipulate things to try to see what changed stories. Let me jump to the third point. I really think it's a valuable goal of the research, not just for applied work, but for theoretical work, to try to come up with an analysis that allows you to figure out what the critical events are at trial for specific cases. Obviously, if you could do this, even if it was just a method, it would be enormously useful in consulting. But I think it would also be a really worthy goal for someone doing story model, theory-driven, more academic research. That is, how can you figure out what the issue is that in a way goes into that list of questions that make for turning points. And finally, I think it's important, I don't think every juror in every case, or all jurors in some, or many jurors in some cases, rely on stories as the mediator or the vehicle for their decision. So I think you have to have a clear idea of well-defined alternatives, and those will probably be easier to study. Now, I wouldn't make fun of the alternative models, but this month's flavor of most popular in jury consulting, I don't know if Cynthia has run into it, the reptile model. And what's the reptile model? Well, let me read you a couple of quick excerpts here. The reptile, this is describing the juror as a creature you want to convert into a reptile if you want to win the case. The reptile is aroused when there is a menace to its own genetic prospects, and such a menace can be discerned in many different kinds of cases. I won't correct the grammar. All defendants that can be seen to threaten the well-being of the community are looking more and more like food for the reptile. Think like a reptile. The plaintiff, defendant, decedent is a threat to the reptiles like your jurors. Anyway, obviously what this pitch is a notion that, I think it was Arthur Kessler introduced the notion of the reptile brain and the mammal brain. You're trying to get the juror to think at the limbic system level with emotional, somatic marker type responses, and then you can win your case. Well, I think that does sometimes happen. I think there are jurors who walk into the courtroom, glance at the defendant, and say, he's gone. And so we should know how to tell, and that's why I called it a litmus test, when it's a story process and when it's not. And again, that's another challenge for story researchers. What is the signature operation you use to say whether it's a story-based decision or something else? Models Gone Wild. Let me ignore most of this slide. I haven't read the book, and I will now. And so I was rather confused by what the model was. I can say that all the models that I've developed are at least 18 years old. So they're over the age of consent. There's no problem if they go wild. They take their t-shirts off, get combined with other models. It's all okay. The trouble with analogies, I'll just make a one-line sort of piece of advice. You have to know what the vehicle is for the analogy. If it isn't well defined, the analogy is not going to work. And let me tell a story on myself. You can say, and many people had before Pennington and me, that, the jury decision is a story-based process. There was an excellent book a few years before ours by a sociologist named Feldman that developed the metaphor of jury decisions as stories, and there are dozens of trial tactic books written before 1989, whenever we started to sell our model, saying, tell stories, stories win cases, the best story wins, and so on. The problem is, what they didn't do was specify what they meant by a story, and that's what Pennington and I tried to do. We tried to rely on the cognitive psychology to research so that the vehicle for our metaphor, that the process is like reasoning through a story, was really well defined and concrete. And if you don't do that, you say it's a director's cut and your readers don't really know what a director's cut is precisely, you're going to confuse them. I really like the point that maybe making deliberation quality one of the key criteria and coming up with good ways to measure it should be an alternative way of evaluating performance. I think that's great. Juries remember, I actually was a little confused by the presentation, but that's because I read the sketchy slides. I think there's just a hugely important, as Bill developed it, I think very effectively, what are the effects of repetition on memory? I've been fascinated. In fact, let me really go back. My dissertation was on repetition effects as inhibitors of correct memory. And there's some studies, actually one of Robert Bjork's students was studying witness memory and did and inhibition, repetition, induced inhibition, induced inhibition effect study. This is just a pitch for PhD students. Here's a perfect subject for dissertation. Repetition effects on witnesses' memories, not juror memories, so I'm kind of riffing on Bill's talk. But what if a juror remembers an event that is schematic, like a 7-Eleven robbery or something, and then they're questioned about what they remember dozens of times. Let's keep it neutral so we could do an experiment on it. Which parts of the memory are strengthened by being questioned, and which parts drop out, and which parts are distorted? The key is you have a schematic event. So there's a narrative in the event, and as surely must happen, there are events that don't fit into the schema, there are events that contradict the schema, and then there are events that are central to the schema. We're going to repeat interrogation of the witness dozens of times, which is exactly what happens to witnesses. What's going to be left? How quickly are the exceptions going to be dropped out? How about just the neutral, irrelevant information? You can go on now, of course, and design, say, or you could design studies with the juror analog, where one jury believes one schema, one story, another, and then they argue with each other and tell their stories several times. Okay, so basically I just zipped through and riffed on the talks. I'm going to skip the stuff like the general remarks. So again, I'm really an advocate of databases, of real jury decisions, vastly neglected kind of data. And anything that NSF or policymakers can do, I think is great. We need to be clear if we're going for story days what the alternatives are, and we need to have operations to sort of identify which jurors are thinking the stories and which are doing something else. And then I have lots of advice about how to do story model research. Thanks very much. And over to Scott. Scott, I hear the garbage man's here. Oh, we don't want it.
I don't have any slides, which is a good thing, because I'm the last thing standing between us and a beer or cocktails or things like that. If I had slides, it'd be longer. Basically, I just want to comment on a couple of quick things. And I guess one of the things that I would like to sort of propose to the group is that in a lot of senses, a jury is an instance of a group. And because of that, we don't have to just think about what we know about juries to sort of think about what we know about what juries might do. And that's one of the things I liked about a lot of the talks in the session was that there was a lot of work coming in from other types of groups research, sort of informing various different aspects of what was going on. And I think that's a very important component. The other thing I want to sort of mention is the notion that, this is a quote from Dick Heckman from many years ago. He said that if you want to figure out how to make groups perform better, watching what they do on their own may not be the best way to figure it out. And I think that, again, is something that obviously we need to study and describe what juries do to get a feel for what are the sort of the key processes going on. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they're doing it particularly well. And I think one of the ways that we can start thinking about new ideas for directions to take jury research can sort of flow from the notion of what do we know about interventions in other types of groups that make them perform better. And so I think that might be one of the ways that we can sort of think about things. And I think a lot of the models that we talked about in this last session provide very nice frameworks for beginning to think about that, because they've done a pretty good job of laying out what are some of the key components, the key areas. As Reed mentioned, if we can go through and figure out what those key turning points are, then we can start talking about what would be the best way for the group to handle those particular points or those particular parts of the schema or the story that they're working with. What are the key parts of the story they have to agree on before we're going to tell them that you're going to make a decision about this? And so I think those are sort of key things that people could begin to think about in terms of not only just studying what groups do, but actually beginning to try to manipulate, try to give instructions to juries about what it is that they're supposed to be trying to do. Now I know from a practical point of view, it's probably going to be tough to get the legal system to allow judges to tell juries how to deliberate. The whole notion now is, well, we just give it to you. You've seen the evidence, go with it. But we also know from a lot of research that people aren't very good at working with groups unless they have some sort of a framework to work within. And randomly choosing a leader and then like going ahead and starting with the discussion probably isn't the best way to go about laying things out. Think about most groups that you work with, they start with an agenda. There's an actual clear point-by-point thing that they're going to try to accomplish today. Juries don't have that. And so beginning to think about, could we provide agendas for them based on what we know about how juries work? Given that they come with different stories or similar aspects of stories, but they're trying to put them together, what would be the things that you'd want them to do to try to put them together? So I think those are some interesting ideas to sort of work from. Two other things. One, the individual versus, or the juror versus jury thing. Again, from the group performance literature, if you don't have good individual group members in terms of performing a particular task, they're not going to be very good as a group. So any intervention that we can do at the individual level to help make individual jurors better decision makers is probably going to have a bigger effect on the overall performance of the jury than anything we're going to do with the actual jury interaction level. Getting people to evaluate the evidence better, to use the information that they have to come to better conclusions. Again, decision trees or ways to lay things out, even just giving them the judge's instructions so they don't have to try to remember them. It's just like, but so I think a lot of the interventions we could do could in fact be at the individual level, helping the individual jurors become better at what they're supposed to do first. But there are also some interventions that we can do at the jury level as well. We know that groups tend to either become sort of verdict-driven or evidence-driven. And they don't differ that much from final outcomes most of the time. But when they are going to differ, probably it's the verdict-driven ones that are going to go wrong first. And again, this is just based on a lot of the work where, like, if you allow people to reach consensus before they've actually discussed all the information, and if there's information out there that could change people's minds, they're going to miss the best alternative out there under those circumstances. So if there's any way that you could intervene in a jury, telling them that the first thing you're supposed to do is get all of the evidence out on the table, or get various, think about what are the key important things you have to decide, and let's get all of the evidence out there and discussed before anyone starts talking about what their verdict choice is. It won't make a difference in a lot of cases, but in those few cases where it could, it might be a good thing to look for. I think the group memory stuff is a great place to look for things like this, because I think, again, just some of the work that Norb's done on, why wouldn't you want people talking to each other before they actually start deliberating? Pretty good reason, because if they spend a lot of time talking to each other, there's certain pieces of information that could fall out of the entire conversation. And so the more we understand about how individual and group interaction affects the information that they still have available to them when they finally have to reach a verdict is a pretty important component as well. The last thing that I want to say, and this is kind of I guess it's sort of a depressing point, but it's very difficult to study groups because you need a lot of people, and it's very hard to get a lot of groups. Unfortunately, I think most of the interventions that we're going to be talking about are going to be sort of like incremental changes in what the groups do. Because generally speaking, on average, groups do okay. You put 12 people in a room and ask them to make a decision, and assuming there aren't any consistent biases, so they're all viewing something in a very different way than they should be, or you've asked them to do a task that they don't have the cognitive, abilities to perform, most of the time, they're probably going to come up with the right response. The majority, more often than not, is going to be correct. the minority members will be convinced that their positions are not viable, and the group will converge on what it is that they're supposed to be doing. So a lot of the changes we're going to make are going to be relatively small. They're good. I think the research is very valuable, and we should be trying to make juries better. We should try to make them as good as they can possibly be. But it's going to be hard to find statistically significant effects doing this, studying juries, because they don't have that much room to move up. They have some. And so I think it'd be really good to when you're looking at particular trials to use, to look for those types of trials where they're most likely to screw up. And then figure out, and then try to test to see if your interventions can actually have some impact. Because otherwise the effects are going to be small, and almost undoubtedly group studies are underpowered. Unless you have like tons and tons of money and just tons of time to put these studies together, they're going to end up with fewer data points than you really need to find statistically significant weak effects. And these are going to be relatively weak effects in a lot of cases. And then after that, I think we should basically start studying the reptile model, because it has a neat name, and we could get some fMRIs and look at the reptile part of the brain, and this would be a lot of fun. But anyways, thank you very much.
So I just want to comment, I thought that was great. I think it's a really interesting debate on whether or not deliberation is important, and I think I sort of fall on the more optimistic side of whether deliberation matters or not, but I'm certainly sympathetic to the idea that it's not always necessary, and I certainly do jury research as well. But I just wanted to throw out one more argument for why I think that deliberation does matter that I don't think necessarily was explicitly said today, although maybe implicitly. I think it's interesting that when we try and debate the value of including deliberation, we tend to always talk about it in terms of its main effect. Do jurors' opinions change from pre to post deliberation? The biggest support that's always given for it is the fact that individual verdict preferences before are such a strong predictor that really, however the majority goes in the beginning is going to predict the group verdict, which I think certainly doesn't provide support that deliberation matters, but I don't think that it necessarily rules it out, because I think it kind of misses the importance of deliberation as a moderator of all the variables that we might be interested in. There are studies that show that a lot of system variables that we're interested in might have an effect before deliberation, but not after, or the reverse. And I think that the fact that the majority is such a strong predictor of the final verdict might, in some cases, actually support the idea that deliberation does matter. And I think it's in those cases where, for example, if you are interested in a system variable and it affects one or two jurors pre-deliberation, and then they get overruled by the majority after deliberation, it's probably going to wipe out the effect of that variable. In which case, I think that the deliberation actually does matter. In that case, it's changing. It's showing that if we rely just on pre-deliberation preferences, that may not actually represent how the group would go, which is what we're trying to do. So I just wanted to throw that out there, that I think that even if we have a lot of evidence that deliberation doesn't necessarily change things overall, I think it's still an important moderator that we should take into account.
Scott Tyndale's presentation reminded me that there's a huge group of questions that would be great for student research, and that has to do with jury questions, interrogatories that are very common in civil cases, especially complicated civil cases. I don't know how many of you have followed the Apple-Samsung civil patent case, but in that case, the jury was presented with a huge set of questions that they had to proceed through, and apparently they did proceed through, to arrive at a verdict, in a particular instance, a verdict favoring Apple and awarding about $1 billion+ in damages. But the questions were apparently confusing enough that after the verdict was announced in court, the attorneys and judge identified some problems, some errors that the jurors had clearly made in transferring what they thought were their verdicts to the damage award portions of this whole complex set of questions. And I use that example to say, you know, I kind of feel for the lawyers and the judge in a case like this, because they haven't had any direction from us that I know of. This is a really understudied topic. Are there ways that you can set up series of questions in a way to maximize comprehension and perhaps appropriate integration of a verdict and, in this case, a damage award? And so I think that's a really understudied topic that we should be able to study and provide, I think, some theoretically interesting insights, but then also some practical insights that people can eventually use.
So that's why they think of the jury story.
You mean because they race through the
Well,
questions?
it was a surprisingly fast verdict, given how complex that case was. So.
A little bit in a different vein, I was really excited by a lot of the talks that were in this session, in part because I felt like it had some potential to go back to something I was talking about earlier at getting at the issue of kind of subject effects and some of the mechanisms by which juror characteristics may affect deliberations and juror verdicts. And I thought that both Laura and what Dennis were saying in terms of creation of individual juror stories that have to be reconciled into a group story or story sampling really tie in nicely with this idea of juror background, and Dennis in particular explicitly referenced this. So the extent to which jurors from different backgrounds have different experiences, have different views on the police, on system, etc., they're likely to create different stories. And if you think about some of the data that are out there in terms of diverse juries talking longer, well, that starts to be very nicely tied into the idea that they have more stories to reconcile. And if they're talking about more evidence, well, different stories may really draw on different pieces of evidence to a greater or lesser extent, or if you have negative experiences with the police, and police are part of one of those, some of that evidence, you may have to spend longer trying to figure out, was it a biased search, things like that, which could start to nicely account for some of those data about diverse juries. But I think that Dennis also made a really good point about the issue of jury participation, and that we know that there are silent jurors, and I think we really need to be looking to see who those silent jurors are, and whether all stories are likely to be equally shared, equally advocated for, equally represented, and what their relative contributions to the final group story are. So I think reconciling some of these models that go from individual stories to group stories, I think really has the potential to both advance our theoretical understanding of deliberation, but also to get at some of the other issues that we, and by we I guess I mean I, talked about over the course of the day.
That's a great point, Jen. I wanted to follow up on that, and also what Reed was saying about needing data. Because as a sociologist who studies the jury, the deliberation, sort of the interaction in the jury room is where it starts for me. I'm interested in that as a sociological question about what happens when a diverse group comes together and how does this interaction play out. And so in relation to the point about needing data, one of the things that I've seen in my work with Valerie is that we're seeing some contextual effects in the way the interaction may play out. So it's not only that you need multiple juries, maybe within a particular area, but you need to look across different cities, across maybe urban versus rural contexts, and see how maybe different sociocultural backgrounds, different individual juror characteristics might play different roles in those different settings. So these are very difficult questions to address without sort of large-scale data, data that enable us to look at patterns in different verdicts across different places, and so on. So, a plea for data.
Just also in reference to that, obviously I tend to think of things in a very micro level, but I talked a little bit about the audience tuning and the saying is believing effect. And what I basically said was that the audience tune, you would come to sort of to a representation that's similar to what you think your audience thinks. This does not hold if you are directing to it as someone outside the group. So in studies by Eckerhoff, he looked at Germans speaking to Turks versus Germans speaking to Germans. And although the Germans speaking to Turks tune very dramatically, in fact more so than they say what they think the Turk wants to hear, it alters their memory not at all. So that at a very micro level, this sort of otherness has an effect that you don't, to use their term, you don't come to a shared representation because you don't want to have a shared or collective representation or a shared memory with this other, and whatever leads to that, that motive no longer exists for you.
Oh, we have
So you have to maximize the upper just one. So Reed's comment on the mega data studies and how someday the court systems will have each guy's recorded, and each vote recorded, all that stuff, every jury, or the characters of the jury. I don't think we're moving there very quickly. I think the reason is the people in charge of the sort of court-related data are, their job is to manage the flow of cases, and so they care about when a case is filed, how long it takes, when it terminates, and when it gets off the judge's docket. They care about nothing else. They don't care about who wins. They don't care about the amount awarded, and they record, often inaccurately, the amount awarded. In the federal database, it was implemented in years when computer space mattered. They only allow 4 digits. So the maximum award that can be recorded still is 9999, and that should stand for $9,999,000. It should be in thousands. But the clerks use the data as a missing value, 9999, or as $9,999. And so when you go and validate the federal court amount data, I think the medians are reasonable, the means are completely wrong, and there's absolutely no incentive for the people in charge of the data to make it better, because all they care about, their data on when it's filed and when it's gotten rid of, and what judge has it, are really good. Nothing else in the system that they really care about. And it's not that they're evil, that's not their job. They're not, I think you need to have a resident researcher or staff in every court in order to get the data we'd be hoping for, because they'd all have to retool their systems completely. I mean, personal experience on the National Center for State Court Committee, Court Statistics Project Committee, we can't get the states to code the type of case being filed. In most states, you can't tell whether it's an automobile accident case or a medical malpractice case or anything else. Now, some states, this is a goal, and some states are doing a much better job than they used to, but there's not uniform or even existing reporting of types of case in many states. So think of getting down to the juror level and getting all this micro data. It would be wonderful, and it should happen, but it would be very expensive, and I don't think the incentives of the people who run the court systems have any, push them in the slightest direction to assist laser research.
Just one last thing. I just got word from the president. He's going to show up in about 5 minutes, so he's going to come talk to us. So we'll break again for probably to say something at that point. But this has been a great day, I think. I can't thank you enough for your contributions today. I at least have one new grant proposal idea over there, which means it was a good day for me. It's always been a good day for me. But we've got wine, we have soft drinks, there's food that's arriving outside, so I hope you stay for a little bit. We'll have a reception here. In your packet, there's a map to the restaurant for the night. It's just a couple blocks from the hotels, but in case you get lost somehow, all that information is in there. Also, there's information in there for your reimbursements for your travel. There's the form that you have to fill out, instructions. I apologize for that you have to take the receipts on a white piece of paper, but this is what we have to do to get reimbursed here. So it gives you all the instructions on that. It also gives you an addressed envelope to the assistant who will be helping me take care of that. So all the information should be there for you. If you have any issues with filling out, let me know. I'll help. Apparently I'm quite good at it. I'm the model faculty member for filling out these reimbursement forms apparently. So I am. No, in fact, the list of instructions I gave to her, I gave it to the admin and said, is this what they're supposed to do? And she says, can I have a copy of this so I can give this to faculty? This is exactly what you're supposed to do. But apparently nobody does it but me. Anyway, that should get you all set. We'll process those as quickly as you can afterward. Just want to get that information out while I'm thinking about it. And in the meantime, have some drinks, have some food, continue our conversations. And 10 o'clock tomorrow morning is the start of the last panel, but we'll have breakfast here for you at the event. So 9:30 is when it starts? I apologize, 9:30 is when it starts. Yes, and I would have been late. I would have been early because I would have been here for breakfast. But we'll see you tomorrow morning, and I hope to see you there tonight. Thanks.
And thank you all for coming, and Margaret's told me it's been a very productive day. The predictable things have happened, which is that there's consensus, there's no consensus on the outstanding issues, and the methodologist loves to debate methodology. So I just wanted to welcome you to the college, and what do you think of the view? I wish the day were better, but you get a sense of what it's like, and people pay really good money for apartments with a view like this. So enjoy it, but just, and I gather you're working again tomorrow?
Yes,
So keep up the good work. It's wonderful to have all of you here. We consider ourselves and like to promote ourselves shamelessly, and I get to be the shameless self-promoter, as a place that likes to be at the cutting edge of research in our fields. We have many fields covered now by John Jay, the new John Jay, the liberal arts John Jay, and it's just great to see the sort of psychology law folks here, and we hope that you feel this is a home for you, and that this is an intellectual home, a place where we talk about tough issues and try to figure out what to do about it. So in that spirit, I'm going to go get a drink. So.